Miriam Rhodes 10-year anniversary reception. Does that mean it's your 10-year anniversary too?
Well, that's a good question. We both have your 15, but she's been here in her ministry.
For 10. Okay. All right. Just getting that straight because I thought it was good. All right. Well, good. Well, y'all be sure to be a part of that. We're grateful for the Rhodes family here. All right. A couple years, many years ago, actually, I was youth minister at a church right out of college, and I had taught myself to play the acoustic guitar. Not very well, mind you. I had like 3 chords, and my suite mates would argue that I didn't really know how to play the guitar. I knew how to play one song because I must have played it a couple hundred times. You know, it's a pretty obnoxious song, to be honest with you. So I moved to Bryant, and I guess word got out that I was interested in learning to play the electric guitar. Now, I didn't grow up. We weren't allowed to listen to rock music in my family, so it wasn't like I was a rock and roll guy or anything. I just thought it'd be really cool. But, didn't make any money, didn't have any money, and certainly wasn't going to spend it on a electric guitar. And so one day, I guess word had got out at the church, and a recent convert who was a recovering addict, drug addict, and still had the long hair and hippie, and that was when tattoos weren't really in vogue or anything like that, but he had plenty of them. But he had a great heart, and he had heard that I wanted to play the electric guitar, so he shows up on my doorstep unannounced with this big, shiny, red, fancy electric guitar and an amplifier. For those of you that don't know what that is, you plug it in there and the noise comes out. But it was about this big. It sounded terrible, but at least you could hear it, right? So it was a thought that counts. And he said, I heard you wanted to play the electric guitar, so here you go. That was a great gift. I mean, holy smokes, I was so excited. The problem is, I didn't know the first thing about him, right? And I really wasn't going to go get any lessons. I mean, I taught myself to play the acoustic. I thought, well, surely this can't be that much more difficult, so I'll just teach myself to play the electric. Well, guess what? Newly married, new job, new ministry. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it. And so after a couple months, guess where the guitar went? In the corner. Yeah, it was over there collecting dust. And it was pretty. It was nice. And, people would come over, hey, it's a nice guitar. Yeah, it is. Do you play it? Not really. So it was a couple months that go by, and my intentioned friend discovers I'm not using it. And so I don't know how long he wrestled with this, but at some point he got up enough nerve to come up and say, do you mind if I take the guitar back? It was an easy decision for me. Take up space in a really small, cramped apartment or give it back. I gave it back. It was a gift, but I gave it back because as well-intentioned as he was, through lack of attention on my part, lack of direction on my part, lack of energy on my part, and enthusiasm. I had high enthusiasm to begin with and low technique. Well, it kind of shifted where, I just didn't use it. And where we find ourselves in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 today tells a little bit about this gift that we've been given. And then what our response should be in relation to this gift. Now, I have to confess that when we look at 2 Corinthians, we spend a long time in chapter 5. I'm not saying it's the most important chapter because they're all important, but the reality is some of the things that we've been learning over the last couple weeks as a congregation, Paul doesn't leave when he enters into chapter 6. He sort of shifts gears here, but there's this automatic tie-in that I think you'll see. But we're going to go to chapter 6, verse 1, and we're going to read 1, 2, and 3 in the very first part of 4. So here we go. And think about this incredible gift that we've been giving and frame that, if you will. As God's partners, we beg you not to accept this marvelous gift of God's kindness and then ignore it. For God says at just the right time I heard you. On the day of salvation, I helped you. Indeed, the right time is now. Today is the day of salvation. We live in such a way that no one will stumble because of us, and no one will find fault with our ministry. In everything we do, we show that we are true ministers of God. And we have to kind of think about the context here about where Paul's going us. In the first verse there, he talks about as God's partners. He's introducing a new word here because he just spent an entire chapter talking about us as being ministers of reconciliation, being ambassadors. So when I said we are God's partners, let me ask you a question. Does the creator of the universe need a partner? Does God, is he so impotent that he suddenly needs our help? Not really. But Paul says we're God's partners. So I got to thinking about that. The simple answer is he doesn't. But in some strange way that only God can understand, he chose you and I as his vehicle to be ministers to the world. Not me, not the guy that stands up here and preaches. He chose us. Those who are rightly connected to Christ, Paul introduces in chapter 5 that we're ministers of reconciliation. We're ambassadors to God. And right off the bat, he sort of shifts gears and says, we're also partners. As God's partners, we beg you, don't ignore the gift, this marvelous gift. So I was thinking about those two terms for a minute. You know, the interesting thing is, as God's partners, I think a lot of Christians get lost in the fact that they want to argue about these societal issues that we face, as important as they are. In fact, a lot of Christians even will argue about theological issues that we've been debating for 30 years. I can remember in the 80s when they were talking about fighting about modern music. Well, there are many churches that still fight about it. We're 30 years past that, right? In this whole time, there's been this focus on things that really don't matter, and what Paul's saying is we're God's partners. We're out there to be reconciling and ministering to the world. There's this whole segment of people, 50% of Springdale, that don't know and don't pursue God. And yet we'll still focus on these other things. So think about the two terms in context. He says last week we talked about being God's ambassadors. Now when you think about that, that's a diplomatic term. You know what I feel like when I hear that? I feel important. I feel somewhat regal, right? Because if I'm an ambassador, I'm somebody special. And that's what Paul said. We're ambassadors for God. But then he says we're partners. I feel regal and important as an ambassador, but when I think of partner, you know what I feel? Responsible. Holy cow. He says we're partners. And I think about that and I think, okay, well, what does that how does that affect me? If I'm a partner of yours in a business endeavor, that implies that you and I have a weight on us that says we got to go get this done. And if I don't do my share, it doesn't get done. And so all of a sudden I go from feeling real regal and real important as an ambassador, feeling I got a responsibility. I'm a partner. And it's different. It feels different. It sets us apart and says we are partners in this grand endeavor to be ministers of reconciliation, to be ambassadors to the world. Then he says it's a marvelous gift, and I think we need a reminder. This gift isn't a shiny red guitar. It's not this great musical instrument that I'm going to set over in the corner. It's much more. Some of the things that we've learned over the last couple weeks, if you've been listening, is it's about life versus death. It's about hope versus despair. It's about joy versus misery, right? It's about being full versus being empty. It's about, though I'm rich, though I'm poor, yet I'm rich. Having nothing but having everything. It's about being free versus being shackled. So when Paul says we are partners with this marvelous gift, he's saying this is something that's incredible. I think that we get so self-absorbed sometimes that we forget that which we've been given. As a connected Christ follower, we've been given a gift that sets us free, but is there to set the world free. You think about that for those that are lost without him. We've talked about the consequences. They'll spend eternity in darkness separated from the love of God. So we, as connected Christ followers, have been given this gift. So what do you do with it? Have you found your interest wane? Oh, sure, we come to church, but I mean, really, this is a gift of life. Have you found your interest in that gift waning? Have you found your schedule so full that you put this gift, you have well intentions, but you put this gift over in the corner and let it sit there collecting dust because you're so busy? I've heard since I was a little kid, preachers have a cliche. Even though it's a cliche, it's true. If Satan can't make us bad, he makes us busy. We get so wrapped up with trivial things, that the gift of life that God has implanted in our heart to share to the world, we set it over in the corner. Sometimes not intentionally, but that's what we do. Did you forget that the gift is a result of his incredible action of sacrificing his son? Did you forget that this incredible gift, we are commissioned by God to be ministers on his behalf to the world, to represent him to the world? Did you know that this gift is big enough to share? Now, sometimes my kids are really good at sharing. We moved to Honduras and had this little bitty 900 square foot duplex and had 3 boys living with us most of the time. And my kids, we took a lot of toys. We kind of transplanted North America into this little duplex. And sometimes my kids were really good at sharing, but there's a couple toys that Grace and Caleb would, it's my toy. You know, this is mine. And they would begrudge sharing it because it meant something to them. What Paul tells us is this is a marvelous gift, and it's big enough to share. I don't have to hold on to it tightly because there's more than enough to go around. If we thought about the full weight of what this gift means, I think we wouldn't be selfish about it at all. It's really the gift that keeps on giving, and we would want to be actively involved in that. But instead, for a lot of us, we only think about this gift on Sundays, perhaps Wednesdays, or when there's a crisis. I mean, think of it this way. I know people that live their life and in such a way that they kind of set this gift on the corner. And Paul says, don't ignore it. He says, as God's partners in this marvelous gift, don't accept the gift and then ignore it. So what does ignore mean? The definition of ignore is to refuse to take notice or disregard intentionally. And the second definition is failure to consider this gift. So think about that. Ignoring something, even when it's the gift from God, is often very intentional. We receive the gift of God, but we quit thinking that it ought to affect all the areas of our lives. We think we have enough control that we really don't consult God. And so what happens, we toot along and do our own thing, even though we've got this gift residing within us, and all of a sudden something happens, and then we remember, oh, we better pray about it. Well, we didn't pray to get us to where we are, you know? So sometimes it's an intentional disregard for this gift. Sometimes it's just failure to consider. Ignoring something even from God, sometimes it's failing to consider what he wants from us, what he's asking us to do. It's failing to consider what he did for us on the cross, what he's doing for us today, and what he's going to do for us tomorrow. So a couple questions for you. Have you been ignoring the gift that you have been given? Are you actively cherishing it every day? Did you start with high enthusiasm and still have high enthusiasm? Are you looking for ways to share it, to give it away, to include others? It's a wonderful gift. Are you looking for ways? Are you open for ways to share that gift? Are you looking for this gift of life to impact each decision you are faced with, each person you come into contact? He says, don't ignore it. Don't ignore this gift. Verse 2 reminds us that when we cried out to God, when we asked for God's help at our deepest moment of need, he was there. We opened up the doors of our heart and opened up the doors to discover that God was already standing there going, yeah. And so he says, today is a day of salvation. So it's twofold. It's to remind us that this gift wasn't an accident. God will go to great lengths to get your attention. And he'll go to great lengths to change you. And we don't get to change. We don't get to choose how he does either one of those. And he says, today's the day of salvation. Cry out to me. And I was there then, and I'll be there today. The good news is for those around us, the 50% of Springdale that is unchurched and unconnected to Christ, today's the day for them as well. Perhaps you're here in the pew today and you don't know Christ. Jeff mentioned it a minute ago. Today's the day. He's standing there waiting. Verse 3 might be a little bit more convicting in verse 1. Look what it says. We live in such a way that no one will stumble because of us, and no one will find fault in our ministry. Paul says we, the community of Christ that he's engaged with, we live in such a way that no one can find fault with us. He's certainly not perfect, is he? But listen to this. Last month, in March, a local pastor in Siloam Springs was arrested for molesting teenagers in the youth group. This past quarter, a church in the Northwest Arkansas quarter, the worship pastor resigned due to inappropriate contact with many people in the church, and it was swept under the rug if he promised to resign. People just think he moved on. Last summer, a church in Springfield, Missouri, which is just a couple hours up the road, a guy had planted the church. It was a tiny church, and now they run 5,000 every Sunday. Had to resign in disgrace. Those are big macro levels of finding fault with the church, right? What about Westboro Baptist? I mean, it's a church from Topeka, Kansas, that's known all over the country and really all over the world. You know what their website is? www.godhatesfags.com. That's their church website. They picket funerals of soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan. They picket their funerals and say that their death is judgment against America for our stance on gay marriage. They went as far as to say that the Newtown, Connecticut shootings of those little elementary students were because Connecticut has some of the loosest morality laws in the country, and that God somehow was judging them by that. Now that's a big level, right? But guess what? To the unbelieving world, they represent us. To the unbelieving world, they don't see. Think about it this way. Westboro Baptist. People drive down this street right here, and what do they see on your sign? Elmdale Baptist. To the unbelieving world, we're lumped in. And Paul says he's able to stand there and say, we find no fault, and yet all around us, to the non-church world, they can look at us and go, wow, it's not much different over there, is it? There's not much going on that's different. Certainly those illustrations seem to be extreme, but think about what Paul is saying here. He lives, works, operates in such a way that no fault could be found in his ministry. And we are challenged to be no different. I can't be perfect. You can't be perfect. Our church can't be perfect. But that's the implication here. We're challenged to live and operate in such a way that we have a credible voice in our community. And that we live in such a way that the definitions ascribed to a few are overshadowed by the love of the many. That's what we're called to do. So I know that those actions, intentionally and unintentionally, causes the world around us to have pause about this wonderful gift. But let's not let that define us. Listen to Acts 15:19. And so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. You know what that's in response to? Peter and John and James was there, and they're all arguing with the church about these Gentiles were becoming believers. And Peter and some of the disciples said, yeah, the Gentiles got to be circumcised no matter how old they are. They've got to ascribe to all the rules and regulations that we have been ascribing to, and tried to force these list of do's and don'ts on these new Gentile believers that it was completely foreign to and had nothing to do with their salvation. It wasn't critical to the message of the gospel. And James's response was, and so my judgment, we should not make it difficult for Gentiles who are turning to God. Now look, when we're known for when we're known as the people that have a list of don'ts, and that's what our label is, we've got a problem. The reality is, in much of the world, we've allowed the dialogue to be defined for us as a group that we're the people of don't do's instead of the people who are full of love and life. Jesus says, I've come that you might have life in all its fullness. The rules and regulations that the world is ascribing to us as a people, it's somewhat unfair. But in response to the scandals that they see, the Westboro Baptists of the world, wow. So I think they're kooky, and I think those people are exceptions. But they're still there. And those definitions are still defining us. You see, I think we've created a religious culture and practices where people coming in just shake their head. They don't know. Now, those are some big, big, high-level, far-away stories in many respects, right? But let me kind of bring it home. Margaret and I moved to Little Rock, Arkansas in 2008 after living for 7 years in Arkadelphia. Arkadelphia is a small town of about 10,000. It's got a big Baptist university there, and all the churches virtually are the same. Now, I'm picking a little bit, but really the culture is such, Danny's been there, he knows, the culture is such that you change maybe the personality of the pastor and maybe the music's just a little, but they're all the same. When you go to Little Rock, you got choices. We felt like we were in a buffet line. I mean, hey, so we visited 12 churches. Now, it'd been a long time since we got to do that. We basically never had that opportunity to just have a clean slate and go anywhere we wanted. So we visited 12 churches, and during that time, our kids were 3 at the time, so we've got this lens on, okay, what's the church like for our family? It was amazing. Consider the time we went to the library and they had Barney playing. Now, we don't keep our kids from watching TV, they just don't watch much, and they certainly never seen Barney. And they're watching Barney in the nursery. Or how about the church where we walk in and we don't know where to go, and there's a couple different venues, and nobody stops and talks to us and tells us where to go. We kind of look around, or we go sit in the back of the church and no one comes says a word to us. Or how about the time when the one church we were so excited to visit because Margot had a friend there from high school that was one of the pastoral staff, and we go there, and it's a congregation of about 150, so it wasn't huge. So you'd think we'd just be like overwhelmed with support and love, right? We go, we sit down, and the kids come with us, and it's one of those churches where about halfway through the kids get up and go to the children's thing, right? So they come and do the worship, so it's family time together, and then I sit there, and Margot takes the kids. She doesn't come back. I'm like, oh my gosh, where's Margot? So, and the preacher was long-winded, a lot longer-winded than I am. And so I go, and we get in the car, and I noticed Margot, I wanted to ask her immediately what was wrong, and she just kind of, she's not going to tell me they're in the church or with people around. So we get in the car. She goes back, and there's a room full of about 35 kids, and there's a senior adult man from the retired military and a special needs teenager watching 40 kids. Now, okay, that guy might be the most well-intentioned, loving person on the planet. He's overwhelmed. It's 35 kids. And one of them is a special needs person and a senior adult. She stayed in and helped. So what did that communicate to me as an outsider? Kids don't really matter. Maybe for those that were coming all the time, that's a real comfortable environment to put your kids in. But from a guest, Margot was scared to death. And praise God, she had enough wisdom to go in there with them, and help out. And so here's a visitor helping out in the nursery. And I got tons of stories in over 12 churches. Just like that, where we go, really? Okay, so that's us. What about Elmdale? Are new people welcome here? If they come here, how do they feel? What's their first impression? When they drive by, do they know where to pull in? This is kind of a confusing campus. Do they know which door to go in? And when they come in, who welcomes them? What do they find? What do they see? What experience do they have when they come in? I mean, is there somebody greeting them in the parking lot and saying, this is reserved just for you. We value you. We want you to be here. Please come. We're excited you're here. Is that what they get? Who greets them? How do they feel welcome? That's a little touchy-feely thing, but how about this one? Is Elmdale's voice credible within the 5 or 10 block radius around us? If people have a crisis in their life, non-believer world, and the son is killed in a car wreck, would they consider coming here looking for help? Do you have a credible voice? I think what Paul's saying is, we lived in such a way where no one was throwing stones at us. That we have a credible voice in the marketplace. That the non-believing world doesn't look at us and goes, those are a bunch of kooks over there. They look at us and say, there's a place of hope. There's a place of refuge. Those are people that care. I don't know them, but every time they go in church on Sunday morning, they're smiling from ear to ear. I want to get a part of that. I want to be a part of that. So that's a big level. What about individually? I'm stepping on toes a little bit, so sorry. What about your speech? What about your actions? Do you live in such a way that the non-believing world cannot find fault in you? Do they see that your life has been irrevocably changed by the love of Christ? Do they feel the connection of you with a living Savior just because of the way you live, breathe, and talk? Could they tell a difference in the way you spend your money? Can they tell a difference in the way that you treat your coworkers or your neighbors or your friends? Because, quite frankly, they're looking. Quite frankly, they're watching. And Paul knew that if we're going to be ambassadors to the world and we're going to be representing Christ, it's going to be a little messy. And it's going to look a little bit different. And our actions and attitudes have to be in alignment with one another. We can't say one thing and do another. I remember our church in Arkadelphia. I play golf. You knew I worked for the PGA, but I don't play a lot after we got the kids. But I'll never forget the guy that was there every Sunday morning to greet us. In fact, his wife was one of the godliest people I've ever met. She died a few years into us being there in Arkadelphia. But this gentleman was it was always at the church, always gregarious. And one day I went out to the golf course and he followed us around. And not only did I discover that he smoked, but I also discovered he had a filthy mouth. And I was like, really? You know, do our actions align ourselves with a changed heart so that the world would go, wow, there's credibility there. I love that. I want to be a part of that. And that's exactly what Paul is saying to us today. Don't ignore this gift. It's a great gift. Don't neglect it either intentionally or unintentionally. Remember the value that's worth. We're partnering with the King of Kings to spread love to the world all around us. It's huge. It's a huge task. But we're up for it because he's right there with us, cheering us on, applauding us, knowing that when we make mistakes, he's still loving us anyway. There's no condemnation. And he knows we're going to blow it. Paul wasn't perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. But we're trying. So, all right, so here's my challenge for you. In what ways are you ignoring God's marvelous gift? Identify those. It's not a rhetorical question. I don't want you to voice it out. But in what ways are you ignoring God's marvelous gifts? In what ways are you failing to be a faithful partner? In what ways do you need to change to quit killing the message that resides within you to the unbelieving world that's watching? There must be something that we all can do better that would make our voice more credible. Finally, are you asking God to make a difference with this church in this community? If we ask, he'll glorify his name through this church and this community. So let's get on board with that. So, all right, during this invitation, I'm asking you to respond. As long as we have invitations, I would tell you that we ought to use them. It's not a stroke for me. But if you stood where I stood and see people that stand up and shift and put their hands in their pockets, start playing with their keys, and their mind's already gone, I'd say we ought to do away with them. But if we have them, here's what they're for you who are church members. They're to come and respond to what God's been doing to you. They're to come and take Steve by the hand and say, I am praying that God will make a difference in our church, that we'll have a loud voice in this community. It's also time for you as a church to make right relationships. This ministry of reconciliation is horizontal and vertical. And maybe you need to grab somebody's hand and say, you know what? I haven't been the kind of friend I need to be to you. As long as we have them, let's use them. If we're not going to use them, why have them? If you're going to disengage, let's quit. But if we're going to have them, let's be engaged all the way to the end. Now, some of you may be visiting. Thanks. Thank you. We value you here. We're excited that you're here. Churches all over America are wanting to be faithful to what God's doing. And this church is no different. So if you're visiting with us, we're grateful. This is a church in transition, but this is a church in progress. And God says we're constantly moving and growing and changing. So if you're visiting with us, welcome. We're glad you're here. We invite you to be a part of what God's doing here. Perhaps you don't know Christ today. And that one little verse, we just kind of skimmed over it. It says, today's the day. So I'd invite you. Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And he's knocking. And all you have to do is respond. And he says, I'm offering you a life in all its fullness. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. There's some of that, right? But there's so much more in a life in fullness. I like that description. That came straight from the lips of Christ. Thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and put boxes around you and burdens and load you up with burdens. But I have come that you might have life. So if you find yourself today and you don't know Christ, Steve's going to be standing down the front. So this is what we do here. This is what this time is for. You would come down and you could talk to Steve, and he'll help you make the most incredible decision of your life. Perhaps that's a little bit too bold for you. That's okay. When the service is over, come talk to Steve or Jeff or myself or Danny or any of the leaders of the church. We'll be glad to set up a time with you and walk through that decision with you. But that's the way we do it here. Let's stand and pray. Father, I'm grateful for today. I'm thank you for your